In the heyday of its industrial power, Detroit boasted of having one of the highest owner-occupied housing rates in the country, thanks to the then booming auto industry that offered well-paying jobs and a gateway to the middle class. In the 1950s, 1.8 million people lived here. Now the population struggles to stay at about 700,000.
The city of Detroit has been steadily losing population since 1950. A lot of people left for the suburbs with the introduction of the interstate system, which goes right through this city. And more of the wealthier residents left, leaving many of the poorer residents behind. So they went to suburbs where there were high levels of public services funded by wealthy taxpayers. And what happened largely was that a sort of downward spiral began, because as the wealthy people left, the level of revenues and services started to decline.
David Alboy is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Michigan, Faculty Research Fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a Research Associate at the Office of Tax Policy Research. He tells me that with a diminishing population, neighborhoods started to feel the neglect as property values plummeted. Little by little, crime rates started to rise.
Some of it probably stems from dissatisfaction in the civil rights movement. And what happened there largely was towards the end of the 60s, there was a belief that while a sort of nominal political equality had been achieved, economic equality was the next step. And there wasn't a lot of feeling at the federal level that anything was going to happen. But as the population tilted towards a more and more African American population, there was increasing, and just the income levels fell. To be honest, the average income levels fell. There was increasing support for the politicians in Detroit to try and rectify the situation on their own by levying higher taxes and providing the services that they felt that the poor needed. But in the end, the upper middle class and middle class people didn't find those services to be particularly valuable and voted with their feet, as we say.
Today, Detroit's homicide rate is at the highest level in nearly 40 years. It's been named as one of the most dangerous cities in America for more than 20 years. Its citizens wait an average of 58 minutes for the police to respond to their calls, compared to the national average of about 11 minutes. Only 8.7% of cases are solved, compared to a statewide average of 30.5%. Also, due to insufficient tax revenue, there are many boarded up vacant houses that residents are pleading and petitioning to have torn down. A lot of these homes have already been stripped of electrical wiring and plumbing by the city, so they serve no purpose but to serve as a hub for crime. And so you can imagine, throughout the years, residents have heard one city official after another vow to improve city services, but little has been done.
Well, I think they do have some right to be upset. What happened was that at the bargaining table, politicians are faced with a tight budget. They have to sort of, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Either they can raise taxes, okay, and possibly cause more businesses to flee, or more people to flee, in order to give people higher wages, right? So that's basically, if you have unsatisfied workers, you have to agree to pay them more. Or you can kick the can down the road by saying, well, we can't increase your pay now, we'll give you a generous pension. And because most politicians aren't going to be around in 10 to 20 years, either because of term limits or just the fact that they get old, means that it's a far easier option when the alternative is to raise taxes and possibly get voted out of office.
Betty Buss is former Senior Research Associate at the Citizen Research Council of Michigan. She served as Director of Policy and Research for Detroit Renaissance until 2006 and has worked as a supervising budget analyst for the city of Detroit. According to Buss, while there are a host of issues that resulted to the status quo, the primary reason has been that Detroit lost its one and only economic base.
Detroit was a manufacturing city. We built cars here. And, you know, national, international forces conspired to make that economic base, those manufacturing companies, move plants out of Detroit, out of Michigan, out of the Midwest, and to some extent now out of the United States. And so we've seen a city that was really very dependent on one economic purpose, making cars. When it lost that purpose, it really wasn't able to pivot to another economic base. And that disproportionate dependence on the manufacturing companies really led to a whole lot of other kinds of things. For example, people who didn't have a whole lot of skills, who weren't highly educated, could get really high-paying, high-benefit jobs in those auto companies. And in the manufacturing plants, they could have a good middle-class lifestyle without a whole lot of education. And that kind of has affected how folks in Detroit think about education. We have lower educational levels here. If you look at the proportion of the population that graduated from college, it's only about 11% in the city of Detroit. That's very, very low. And a lot of folks attribute that to the fact that there were all of these low-skill, high-wage manufacturing jobs here for so long that we just didn't develop that value for education that some other cities, more successful cities, have had.
The auto industry as a whole sort of dictates the situation in the Detroit metropolitan area in general, all of Southeast Michigan. And what's gone on is initially the auto industry provided local residents here with unprecedented amounts of prosperity. People forget that Detroit, in per capita terms, was the richest city in America 60 years ago. It was fascinating. It was arguably the first time in history that the common man, such somebody willing to work a long day at the factory, could have his little castle and carriage, which in those days was having a modest home with a yard, having a car, having a small lawn, being able to put food, even meat on the table, and for being able to provide basic education and health care for their families. It was a phenomenal time in history. And the high wages that were paid by the auto industry to workers of all skill levels made that happen, right? Ford and the $5 a day. He wanted people to have the wages so that they could afford their own product, their own cars, right? So that persisted for a long time.
With people leaving Motor City for years, schools today have less tax revenue, directly affecting Detroit's public school children. The Detroit News reports that nearly 50% of the city's taxable property parcels were delinquent on their 2011 tax bills. That amounts to about $246.5 million in unpaid taxes. Fewer residents has also resulted in schools shrinking in pupil size, which has been one reason why schools have been shut down.
When we talk about loss of population, a lot of folks who leave cite two primary reasons: high crime and poor schools. When you talk about the loss of the business establishments, and if you look at the last 35 years for which we have good data, Detroit lost 2/3 of its business establishments over that period of time. If you look just at manufacturing establishments, Detroit lost 80%. Well, crime has an impact on that as well. So we look at crime, we look at deindustrialization, we look at depopulation, we look at blight, we look at poor schools. They're all connected. They're all connected with employment opportunities, with educational levels, with the condition of neighborhoods, with the quality of city services, with the quality of public schools. You can't say that one of them stands alone. There is so much interconnectedness here that it makes trying to figure out how to solve the problems very difficult, because you can't have a single solution because the problems are all connected.
Damaged by cuts in state aid and a crash in real estate values, the city started to borrow to meet operating costs, as well as long-term liabilities.
The city has had a pattern of borrowing to fund current operations, whether that's deficit funding bonds or bonding to pay for lawsuits or self-insurance or other kinds of things that should have been paid out of regular operating revenues. That has contributed to a very high liability burden, but it wasn't necessary if the city had made better management decisions. The city has a host of operating problems, but again, had there been better management decisions made over a very long period of time, those problems would not be as big as they are. So when you talk about, 60 years in the making, yeah, the economic base has been declining, but that doesn't mean that hard decisions couldn't have been made anywhere along the line to look at other ways of delivering services, to look at the service levels that were being promised and the service levels that were being delivered, to change the trajectory of the liability burden and to avoid the point where we are right now.
By filing for Chapter 9 bankruptcy on July 18th, Detroit has sought protection from all its creditors. Detroit is the largest American city ever to file for bankruptcy. Its long-term debts are estimated at $18.2 billion, or $27,000 for each resident. Kevin Orr has been appointed by the governor of Michigan as the emergency manager. The appointment has raised concern among some residents, many taking to the streets and protesting the governor's decision. They believe that the Republican governor himself is the face of Detroit's bankruptcy, and now he's picked an emergency manager to run the city instead of the mayor and city council.
We are demonstrating because emergency management is wrong. And this takeover has hurt Flint, it has hurt Pontiac, and it's going to hurt Detroit. I mean, what's the purpose of having city council and a mayor if you're going to bring in an emergency manager?
I believe that the people do have power. We need to grow this group that's ready to come out in the streets. I believe there are a lot of people that believe this way. We just need to get them out here and show the rest of the city that we're together on this.
Detroit's elected leadership is black and Democratic, while Michigan Governor Rick Snyder is a white Republican backed by a GOP-controlled legislator. Those differences have helped to heighten tension between the city and state officials. However, both sides agree they will ultimately have to work together to get out of the current gridlock. Detroit is no stranger to bailouts. During the darkest days of the recession, Washington bailed out two of Motor City's biggest businesses, General Motors and Chrysler. And while the memories of bankruptcies by Chrysler and General Motors and the reemergence of those companies have calmed some nerves, corporate bankruptcy procedures are significantly different from municipal bankruptcies, as the process may prove more costly on the residents and the city than initially anticipated. With the national debt at $16.7 trillion, President Barack Obama has had a hard enough time getting his present proposals through Congress.
I think Detroit would love to get a bailout. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think that the federal government is going to step up to bail out the city of Detroit. And I think that if the state decides to participate in Detroit's recovery, it will do that on kind of an in-kind basis. I don't think it will mean the state writing a big check to the city government.
Bus tells me that despite all the problems, bankruptcy was not inevitable.
I think that the trend has been obvious, but I don't think that it could not have been changed if there were the political will to do that. Part of the problem is, of course, not just that Detroit has a high proportion of low-income people now. It's that the city government is now so much smaller than it used to be. If you go back to 1950, when the city had 1.85 million people, the city government had over 27,000 employees. Now it has fewer than 10,000. And so there's a disproportionate burden of legacy costs for retirees, for example. There's twice as many retirees from the city government as there are active employees. And yet, it's been a retching kind of shrinkage of the city government, but I don't think it was inevitable that the city would run up the kinds of debts that it has.
Today, the biggest concern that falls over Detroit residents is what will happen to the city's employees that were depending on their pensions after their retirement. When Detroit reported $18 billion in liabilities as part of its bankruptcy calculations, most people were prepared for the $3.5 billion in unfunded pension liabilities. Many were surprised to see the much larger amount of $6.4 billion in their other post post-employment benefits, primarily obligations to pay healthcare premiums for retired public employees. How Detroit handles this problem of not enough money set aside to pay the pensions it has promised its workers is being closely watched by other cities with fiscal troubles. Emergency Manager Kevin Orr has called for significant cuts to the pensions of current retirees. His plan is being fought vigorously by unions that point out that pensions are protected by Michigan's Constitution, which calls them a contractual obligation that shall not be diminished or impaired. Governor Rick Snyder signed off on the bankruptcy strategy that authorized Orr to cut pension funds. Orr has not said specifically the degree to which pensions would be cut under the reconstructuring proposal to resolve up to $20 billion in Detroit's debt and long-term liabilities. Orr and his consultants are in discussion with the city's two pension boards, the General Retirement System and the Police and Fire Retirement System as well. Many retirees see the plan to cut their pensions as betrayal.
The unions here are definitely feeling embattled. They are feeling threatened. This will exacerbate that. And retirees, I think, are looking at this, public sector retirees across the country, and wondering if, in fact, this new position that Mr. Orr has taken is going to prevail, what the possible implications for them will be. And it is very serious. I mean, depending on how you look at pensions, whether this is some kind of unearned largesse that has been promised, or whether this is deferred compensation that people have earned as they spent their 25 or 30 or 35 years working for municipal government. But it could have wide-ranging repercussions, and I think that both union members and retirees do see this as possibly precedent-setting and potentially very, very threatening.
A day after the city filed the unprecedented bankruptcy, the people were given a deadline. Governor Rick Snyder and his emergency manager, Kevin Orr, promised weary residents that they would see better city services in 30 to 60 days.
But to be a great state, we need that path of Detroit being on the path to being a great city again. Today is a major step in getting on that path to say the downward spiral, it's time to stop. It's time to move forward. It's time to get Detroit stabilized and to grow.
If Mr. Orr, who is the emergency manager, is able to achieve what he has said he wanted to achieve, that would in fact be groundbreaking. That would be precedent-setting, and that would provide what I think a lot of other fiscally distressed municipalities would see as an opportunity to shed some of that burden. And the two big issues that I see that are precedent-setting are treating retirees as unsecured creditors. And remember, back in 2008, a lot of pension system assets, not just in Detroit, but personal pension retirement plans, the 401ks, as well as public plans and private plans, saw the value of those assets decrease dramatically. And there's been some recovery, but we're not, none of us across the country, where we thought we were going to be in terms of our retirement plans. So a lot of retirement plans are much more poorly funded than we expected them to be 5 or 6 or 7 years ago because of what's happened in the real estate market, the stock market. So there are a lot of communities that have significant financial distress based on pension promises that have been made. If Mr. Orr is successful in treating retirees as unsecured creditors, that will establish a precedent as to how other communities can treat their retirees.
Betty says the other big, possibly precedent-setting position that the emergency manager has taken is the treatment of people who bought unlimited general obligation bonds, debt that was guaranteed by an unlimited property tax levy. And in Detroit, that was $9.6 million last year. Orr said that he wants to consider these as unsecured creditors as well. It's yet to be seen how far he will carry his promise. These residents of Detroit, who've spent all their lives living in Motor City, don't believe that Detroit is bankrupt.
I'm telling you, they're not broke.
And all these people is homeless, and they got houses. They just holding on to it, let the people have the houses, and just fix them up. A lot of them do that kind of home improvement or whatever, but they're just holding on for tax write-offs.
What they should do is what they won't do.
Right.
They should put somebody up in there that's going to run the city. It's going to bring money to the city. What they won't say we're broke. We're not even broke. Every time you tell the truth about the city of Detroit, they want to hate you, dislike you. They don't care about you. They want you out of here.
In downtown, is 25% of Detroit. There's so much more of Detroit. I think the city government needs to, pay more attention to the people living out of downtown. Put more money in getting, the streetlights back on, the bus systems going. Because, the way people can pay taxes is getting to the jobs. You don't have a bus to do that, you can't work.